Welcome everyone, StealthyShiroean here, and today I'm bringing you my review of Tokyo Dark. This game was developed by Cherry Mochi, published by Square Enix Collective, an indie game division of Square Enix, and released in September 2017. Tokyo Dark tells a creepy mystery in the form of a point-and-click adventure. Normally, this wouldn't be my go-to genre of game to play, but the story was compelling enough to keep me engaged until the end. The presentation, as is shown, uses an anime graphic style for the cutscenes and gameplay. The actual cutscenes are very nice and were made by an actual Japanese animation studio. That said, the cutscenes didn't seem to be as long as I would have liked, or as numerous, meaning that they reused several of them multiple times. My guess is because they were running on an indie game budget. I also liked the portraits that were used during the dialogue, but the game definitely would have benefited from having multiple states of the portraits to convey different emotions. However, I felt that the actual character models in the gameplay could have benefited from a bit of extra polish. The animations of the main character felt stiff, like she literally was some sort of doll. Also, some of the backgrounds were a little flat. I think some added textures or perhaps some more parallax effects would have helped make the background stand out a bit more. On the other side of the presentation, the music for the game was pretty good. I especially liked how they used it really well to create tense moments. Sound design, on the other hand, was shockingly sparse. I think this was because most of the game was dialogue with the characters, so there wasn't a lot of interaction just with the world itself. But some more ambient noises would have been appreciated. In the story department, players take the role of homicide detective Ayami Ito, who is trying to find her missing partner. After an unfortunate event, she comes into the possession of a mysterious mask linked to a spree of past murders. Along the way, she meets a myriad of characters that all try to either help or hinder her progress. She also learns more about the dark secrets lingering behind the mystery, the mask, and an ever-encroaching darkness that seems to exist all around us, just out of mundane sight. One thing to note is this game is dark. I mean, it's in the name. But really, the game deals with some heavy stuff like forced sex work, mass suicide, abuse, murder, etc. So this definitely isn't for everyone. I would say that nothing seemed overly shoved in the player's face, but if you're uncomfortable with any of these topics, then you probably should stay away. Horror and degrading sanity plays a role in this story, and actually is what initially drew me to it. I love some Lovecraftian themes in my horror which deal with things like degrading sanity and cosmic entities, and this game actually has both. However, the horror elements felt few and far between during the middle of the game, as you're piecing together the story, which was slightly disappointing. Another thing that was a bit disappointing was much of the story was linear in its telling. There's not much deductive reasoning going on, rather more solely reading what is presented to the player. I was surprised because the game has 11 different endings that I had supposed were based off of choices the player make along the way. And while this is true, it's largely determined by how the player manages their stats. More mention on this in a bit, and what choices they make that affect these stats along the way. There were only a few key moments that really drastically changed the story in a meaningful way. As already stated, Tokyo Dark is a point-and-click adventure game. You move the character around a 2D scape and interact with the various interactables to progress the story. Normally, I'm not a fan of these kinds of games, but Tokyo Dark isn't a typical point-and-click to what I've played before in the past. First, there is no inventory to manage, which is something I actually appreciated a lot. One of the things I despise in point-and-clicks is when I have no idea what to do, so I'm trying to combine or use every single item in my inventory with various things in the world. That's always really annoying for me, and there's none of that here. Another thing that Tokyo Dark doesn't really have is any sort of puzzles. They did exist, but in a very minimal capacity and nothing that was too difficult. Again, I'm not quite a fan of these, but I suppose I was expecting more from the game. I would have been happier if they had more narrative puzzles that utilize the information you gathered. That way, it would have felt more like the game rewarded the player for paying attention to the clues, or character traits, or backstories that the player learned along the way. Actually, I felt these choices weren't sometimes well conveyed to the player as to what they could or couldn't do, leaving me feeling kinda cheated at times. One particular standout example is when I was trying to find who might be poisoning some cats. You have to question a few people on the street, one of them being such an obvious choice that it couldn't possibly be them. I assumed I needed to gather more information or some evidence to narrow down the suspects, but no. It was just a guess, and of course the obvious choice was incorrect. As I mentioned, the game is fairly linear with not many branching paths. There are usually a few actions to choose when getting through an encounter, although I'd say many of them aren't the ones you're likely to choose with your first playthrough. Unless you just like playing a game to see what sort of hijinks you can get into, and the story or good resolution be damned. This is because almost every choice you make affects your spin metrics, which stand for sanity, professionalism, investigation, and neurosis. The first two being the most important because it affects what actions you can or can't take that ultimately affect the ending. Obviously, doing crazy things, like threatening a detective in the police headquarters, will make you lose professionalism, and playing with your cat will raise your sanity. Investigation apparently makes certain things noticeable for you to click on, and neurosis is a stat that increases the amount of sanity damage you take. Actually, neurosis was a bit odd because it punished the players for continually trying to talk to people after they already told them information. Normally, a player's instinct would be to exhaust the dialogue of a character, and it's something that games have trained us to do. Tokyo Dark almost makes fun of this notion by increasing the character's neurosis when this happens. By not always clicking on the character to hear one more thing, this left me always feeling like I might be missing something, which is probably exactly what Tokyo Dark wanted me to feel. That said, it's unfortunate that the spin system felt underutilized. None of the stats were particularly hard to keep maintained, and the only way you'd really be in danger is if you were purposely putting yourself in that situation. During the first playthrough, you can't save and all of your decisions are final, so you probably will be playing it on the safer side. The New Game Plus mode allows you to make save points throughout the game so that you can strategically set yourself up to see the rest of the endings. This means you can appease your reckless abandon as you see fit with no repercussion. Finally, while these are mainly nitpicks, they were noticeable, so I'll mention them here. Basically, this is an indie game, and it comes with a bit of jank. Most noticeably was loading into a new scene. Many times when it would do that, I noticed the camera pan across the scene to where it was supposed to load into, or the character falling from the sky until she was put into the proper place. Also, loading in would be accompanied by a flash of light a lot of the time. Although, I wasn't sure if this was intentional. Either way, I wasn't a fan. And at times, there would be items that would be interactable, but I couldn't interact with them. Luckily, this was usually after I'd already interacted with them, so I imagined that the interactable icon just hadn't disappeared. And that brings us to the value of the game and my closing thoughts. If you've enjoyed the video or found it helpful, then please consider leaving a like, as this helps me out greatly with the YouTube algorithm gods. I put 5 hours for one playthrough into Tokyo Dark, and it runs for $17.99 USD at normal retail price. Yes, there are technically 11 different endings, but I imagine the subsequent runs would take considerably less time since you would have read most of the content before. For myself, I was happy with my one ending, the purification one for any interested, and was then content with watching the rest of them on YouTube. I briefly considered a New Game Plus, but I really am unsure of the replay value here. Much of the game followed a linear path, the game spoon-feeding the story to the player, so I didn't really see much of a point just to see the slight deviations in the rest of the endings. However, everyone's mileage will vary depending on how in-depth you want to go with seeing everything the story has to offer. I would definitely recommend this game though, but only on a sale. There's a good story here, and even with some of its flaws, it was still a fun time. And those are my thoughts on Tokyo Dark. If you played the game, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't, then let me know if this sounds like something you'd be interested in, or if you have any other questions. I hope this video helped you in some small way, and if it did, then please consider leaving a like, comment, subscribe, or whatever it is you feel like doing. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day.